Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on Green to Go, looking at how the Canadian government in particular is working to reach net zero across its operations. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK senior civil servant, and I'm chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, a publishing house that serves civil servants and public servants all around the world. If you've just joined the webinar today, you should be seeing on your screens that we are offering this in French as well as English. If you would like to switch to French, click on the interpretation icon and you can choose French as an option there. Now, in terms of today's topic, countries around the world have signed up to international climate agreements with a view to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and moving to a net zero future. To achieve this, they are working across the wider public sector and the private sector on everything from insulating homes to moving to renewable energy sources. But they also need to consider the impact of their own operations. And that's what we'll be focusing on today, looking in particular at how Canada is greening its own government activities, everything from zero emission vehicles to greening its procurement practices. We have two fantastic speakers with us, and I'll be introducing them in a moment. But once we've heard from our speakers, this is also your opportunity to put your questions to that panel. So please, on your devices, you should see you have a Q&A function. Use that Q&A function from any time now to send in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of the webinar. Now, I recognise that in addition to our Canadian colleagues joining us here today, we may also have some American civil servants and public servants. And while we don't actually have a speaker from the American government, many of the issues today will be relevant and very transferable to the American context. So please don't be shy. If you're from America, please send in your questions as well. I know our two speakers will be very happy to answer those. And now to introduce our great speakers today. First, we will hear from Nick Xenos, who is the Executive Director for the Centre for Greening Government at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. The Centre is working with federal departments and agencies towards zero carbon, sustainable and climate resilient government departments. Previous to this position, Nick has worked on climate change impacts and adaptation, Arctic science, space policy, and infrastructure policy. A really fantastic career there. So it's great to have Nick with us today. And then we will hear from Thierry Spies, who is Senior Manager for the Advanced Vehicle Programme at the National Resources Canada, where he is responsible for light duty vehicle policy and zero emission vehicle awareness. In addition, which is what he will focus on today, Thierry oversees the Greening Government Operations Fleet Programme that supports federal departments in their transition to electrify their fleets. Prior to joining the government, Thierry worked at the Centre for Urban Energy in Toronto, studying grid resilience strategies. It's wonderful to have you both with us here today. As I said to the audience, please do send in your questions at any point. If you would like French, please click on interpretation to switch to French. And now, though, I'm going to invite Nick to give us his opening comments. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Siobhan. Merci beaucoup. Très content d'être ici aujourd'hui. Happy to be here and to share some of what we're doing in Canada and some of the stuff we're working internationally on as well. So let's go to the next slide. Basically, the government of Canada, as Siobhan said, is conscious, of course, that to take climate action also means to take action within our own operations. And so let me give you the policy context a little bit in Canada first. So obviously, internationally, we've all committed to the Paris Agreement. So nationally, in the middle of this here is we have essentially two plans, updated plans, if you will, in Canada. And I'll come back into a bit more detail on that in the next couple of slides. But let me first talk about Canada has this overall plan to get to 45% lower emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That's the emissions reduction plan of the Government of Canada, led by our Environment and Climate Change Canada. And within it, one of the components is that we need to show leadership in our own operations. And so Canada developed something called the Greening Government Strategy to get our operations to zero carbon. And we also have the policy on green procurement. And those are managed centrally within the Treasury Board Secretariat. And I'll come back to that. So let's go to the next slide and start at the big picture. So Canada's climate progress. We've had subsequent throughout the years various plans working with provinces and territories. We're a federation, obviously, so similar to the US and other federations where you really need concerted action across different levels of government. In 2020, the government released its Strengthened Climate Plan, and then we also released the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which really introduces new requirements related to transparency, accountability, and certainty to get to net zero. And then on the right, there's various things that have happened, but Canada's done some good progress. Our electricity grid is 82% emissions free, for example. 136,000 Canadians have taken advantage of the federal incentive to buy electric vehicles, et cetera. So, and there's many programs and measures in place that are happening to get to zero carbon. Next slide. The most recent 2030 emissions reduction plan really aims for the 40 to 45% by 2030. It's a major step in terms of including programs, or it's got a list of various programs in us for each sector. So we always talk about, transportation, buildings, agriculture, industrial, etc. And so this plan has a roadmap for each of those sectors on how to get it to 40-45% below 2030 and put in place the building blocks we need for net zero by 2050. And it's, of course, an evergreen plan because you'll need to adapt it and keep moving forward and accelerate it with new technologies, with new initiatives that are going on. So this is Canada's plan, is to really move forward, and lots of engagement happen, including there's a net zero advisory body for the Government of Canada. Next slide. So in that plan, on looking at sector by sector, there's also horizontal type initiatives, we call them. And one of those is us, the Government of Canada, in its own operations needs to get to net zero. So our unit was placed, and this is an interesting sort of lesson learned within governments anywhere. If you're going to have a strategy to green the government's operations, it makes sense to attach it somewhere that's close to procurement policy and real property policy and fleet management policies. So Treasury Board Secretariat is the management board for the Government of Canada, and it's a good place because this is where we're situated, and our job is to implement the Greening Government Strategy with departments and to track the Government of Canada's emissions writ large. Next slide. So the first thing to do if you want to green your operations is you got to measure where those emissions are and where to focus your attention. So, this is all information on our website as well. So part of our, the Center for Greening Government, what we want to do is find that information, post it, be transparent and open on it, and then target the biggest sources of emissions. So this won't be surprising for any national government, whether it's the US government, the Canadian government, or any government, national government. Our emissions can be summarized here. So on the left is our emissions from buildings and fleet. In the top left is how much emissions from our buildings. And in Canada, it's usually heating is the problem. So it's how do we heat in a zero carbon way? And then in other countries, it might be electricity might be larger than heating, of course, but you might have air conditioning. The bottom left, is the emissions from our national safety and security. And this is typical of any national government as well. The military operations, policing, Coast Guard type operations are quite huge, and marine and aircraft emissions, you can see there, are quite significant. So on the left is our scope 1, 2 emissions. That's our direct emissions and our electricity emissions. And on the right is an estimate of our emissions, scope 3 emissions, so from procurement, air travel, commuting, etc. And that's we have a little less scope of control because, of course, this is the emissions to make the things we buy, or from commuting and air travel, which are decisions that individuals, public servants make. Now, air travel was a little bit larger, but of course, due to COVID, that's gotten quite a bit smaller. And commuting as well would have gotten a bit smaller as well, of course, during COVID. Now, what we've seen on our procurement emissions is emissions come from some of those big things that aren't surprising. Construction materials that we buy, energy. So it's the carbon to take fuel out of the ground and ship it to somewhere where we burn it. And that's the emissions on the left. And then emissions from ships, equipment, aircraft, things like that is also a big chunk. So again, lots of emissions, obviously, in the things we buy, IT as well. And so why is it important for a national government to reduce its emissions? Well, national governments tend to be the largest entities some of the largest entities in the country. So the Government of Canada owns 50,000 buildings and assets, 40,000 fleet, and we buy $18 billion of stuff a year. So we're the largest asset owner and public procurer in Canada. And so it's important to make sure we show leadership and show the example of how we can get to zero carbon. And the Government of Canada is committed to that in its greening government strategy. Next slide. So the strategy really focuses on those, and these kind of mirrored some of the sectors of the overall climate plan for Canada, but real property, fleet, procurement, which is procuring a lot of things that the industrial sector makes. And then, of course, we also want to be climate resilient, so adapt to a changing climate for our operations. And we want to aim for 40% reduction by 2025, so that's slightly ahead of our national plan, and then zero by 2050. And to date, we're at 40% reduction in emissions on our real property and conventional fleet. So we're good. And we're one of the few countries that have scoped in military emissions and procurement as well. Next slide. So here's some of the commitments for an example of what it takes to get to zero carbon. Now it could be an abstract concept. How do we get to zero carbon? Well, here's some of the commitments that will get us there. So the Government of Canada has required that any new building be net zero carbon and climate resilient. For retrofits, we're using a shadow price of carbon of $300 a ton because we want to make sure every retrofit of every building is as deep decarbonized as possible. You usually get one shot at a deep retrofit of a building over 30, 40 years. If you don't take advantage of it, then that building's going to be there in 2050. So we want to buy 100% clean electricity by 2025. We're about 87% now of our electricity is from zero carbon sources. We want to divert 75% of our operational waste. And we want to disclose the embodied carbon in structural materials, think cement, steel, etc., construction, by 2022 and reduce it by 30% starting in 2025. And we're also part of an international initiative looking at how to reduce emissions from construction materials by then. For vehicles, 75% of the vehicles we buy have to be green, with the aim of 100% light duty fleet being electric by 2030. For national safety and security, we've working with our Defense Department, Coast Guard, and RCMP to develop a fleet decarbonization plan by 2023. And we've also created a fund, $237 million, to buy low carbon fuels for our air and marine. On mobility, we're encouraging flexible work arrangements and low carbon forms of transportation, of course. And we have something called the Greening Government Fund, which we charge departments the carbon price on their air travel emissions. And then we create a fund centrally that we deliver to fund green projects for those departments. Let's go to the next slide. Climate resilience will be important for any national government. So we want to make sure that we do a risk assessment and then take action to ensure our assets, operations, and services are climate resilient. Because of course, floods, fires make a huge impact, right, on the operations of any government. The pandemic has shown us that we can telework, for example, and be flexible. So if a building goes down or can't be accessed because of flood or fire or other extreme events, then how do we make sure that our operations are continue? So that's key for any government. And then green procurement. what we're aiming for is net zero, and what we're doing is looking at those high impact categories of things we buy, focusing on what are the requirements in those areas. And then we also want to think about some horizontal things like incenting major suppliers to adopt the science-based target and disclose emissions. And of course, eliminate unnecessary use single-use plastics in our operations to reduce waste. Next slide. So we publish this on the web. We publish what our emissions are by department and how we're tracking progress to get there. And again, we're doing pretty good, but it's a nice kind of way where departments can compare their progress against others. Next slide. And of course, for national governments, a lot of the emissions come from defense, correctional facilities, office buildings, science labs, etc. This is just examples of some of the progress we've had to date. I won't go through it all, but we're procuring electric vehicles. We're increased teleconference time to lower emissions from commuting and increased telework. 87% of our electricity is from zero carbon sources. We have over 200 net zero carbon buildings, etc. So we'll go to the next slide. Collaboration. So while we're greening our operations, we want to work with others to see what we can learn. And that's why fora like this are so important and helpful, is how do we get the word out and show the path of how to get there and learn from others who are on that path and getting there. So we want to learn what are the best practices out there. So we also so I chair a forum with Crown corporations, which are arm's length sort of federal entities. So we have a community practice with them, and that I co-chair with Canada Post. We have a federal, provincial, territorial community of practice where the provinces and territories, so sub-national governments and us, get together on greening our operations. We also cooperate with other large green buyers called the Buyers for Climate Action, so that we can coordinate and learn from each other on what we're doing. Internationally, we have a community of practice we've created that I co-chair with my American counterpart in the White House, Council on Environmental Quality, that we launched. So we launched an international group community practice on greening government called the Greening Government International Initiative strategy, and it was announced last year. And so the U.S. has an equivalent to our greening government strategy. It's an executive order on greening their operations and in getting to zero carbon. And so we're quite we've informed each other quite a bit on how we're working towards zero carbon and when we first developed the greening government strategy, we went down to Washington and learned from their executive order that they had, and then when they wanted to refresh that, they spoke to us and looked at what we're doing and what other countries are doing in order to see what their new executive order should look like. So, and similarly, they're taking action on buildings, fleet, electricity, and procurement generally, and climate resilience. And so we've been sharing best practices throughout in all of those areas. And then, of course, there's, and I'll come back to the Greening Government Initiative in a second, but there's also other international cooperation. IDDI is the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, focused on construction materials, and CFIT really focuses on information technology and how we can green procurement of that. Next slide. So, Greening Government Initiative, I'll talk about it a little bit more since we have some international folks. It's the first real global community practice for leaders in charge of greening their government operations. And again, we co-chair it with the US. We've got actually now over 40 countries that have joined and endorsed it and participate. It was launched by our minister and Brenda Mallory at the Council on Environmental Quality in the US. We've had several meetings, 3 or 4 meetings a year, and over 40 countries have participated. So lots of interest. Next slide. And of course, in all these countries, the national governments are huge, right? And so we have a responsibility to green our operations. So the aims is really to increase the velocity of our initiatives, lever global best practices, accelerate experimentation and sharing of info, strengthen foundation for industry cooperation, amplify communications. If we can signal to the market that we're all moving in this direction, And then, of course, inspire and help learn for members and non-member nations to keep improving. And basically, as I say, if we're all going to the dance, then we all go to the dance, right? It's if everybody thinks everybody's going to go to the high school dance, we're all going to the dance. So we're all going to the zero carbon dance, and how do we get there together? Next slide. Lots of potential areas of work. I mentioned a few, but you can see the long list here. Really, it's about climate resilience, buildings, fleet, electricity, procurement, etc. And lots of non-carbon areas too, like biodiversity, food waste, water waste, and those kinds of things. And so we're really keen to work with others and happy to. And I'll leave it there, and I'll pass it on to Thierry, who's going to go a little bit more into detail on the fleet side and give examples of what some of the good work is happening over there. So over to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nick. I mean, what a great place to start, because you've really set out that big picture. So it's great to have that overview of kind of the international agreements, you know, the Paris Agreement signed up to overall, those steps along the way, as you say, the 2030 targets. But then just showing the huge range of activity already underway. I don't think everybody realizes how much this affects the entire kind of range of what government does, all of those different departments having to do a bit there, and just why it's so important that governments show leadership on this, because they are such big operations in their own right. As you say, 18 billion pounds spending power there in Canada alone. But also you mentioned the importance of collaboration. Hopefully events like this help, the importance of sharing good practice across national boundaries, but also that international community as well. So really good place to start. And one of the things you mentioned in those activities was the decarbonising of fleet. So as you say, I see we've already got lots of questions coming in, but before we get to the questions, let's hear from Thierry. Over to you, Thierry. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks, Siobhan and the Global Government Forum for setting up this panel. I think this is just an excellent forum for us to come together. I think some of the challenges are quite similar as you look at sort of, you know, leading by example, what it really means on the ground. You know, Canada, US, other countries as well are really at the forefront of this transition to net zero carbon. So hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm thankful and honored to live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who have lived here since time immemorial. Nick, I'm just in awe at the breadth and variety of your mandate, and the presentation I think showed that quite clearly, that, you know, it really is such a multifaceted approach when it comes to greening government operations. You think of buildings, fleets, obviously all the properties and so on. So it's just the magnitude and scale and scope is just really mind-boggling. So fleets, they fit in, but they're clearly just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Next slide, please. So as you mentioned, Nick, the Greening Government Strategy, or GGS, you know, previously required 75% of new conventional fleet vehicle purchases to be zero-emission vehicles, or ZEVs, as well as hybrids, with the objective that the entire fleet be at least 80% ZEVs by 2030. Now, the government has committed to accelerate this target and electrify the entire federal fleet of light-duty vehicles by 2030. Just sort of, again, in keeping with our more ambitious targets under the Paris Agreement and other international objectives to really decarbonize our economy. The GGS, the Greening Government Strategy, also directs departments to optimize their fleet management to achieve these targets, including by assessing ZEV charging infrastructure needs, applying telematics to analyze fleet vehicle use, as well as look at the data and how we can accelerate the replacement of vehicles. And this is where NRCan, or Natural Resources Canada, comes in. Next slide, please. So before diving deeper into what it is that we do, probably it's worth having a quick look. And Nick, I think I cribbed one of your one of your graphics here for my own purposes, having a quick look at what the federal fleet actually looks like. So it comprises of almost 30,000 vehicles, with almost 18,000 in the conventional fleets, and more than 12,000 in the national safety and security fleet, operated by Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I guess, which is similar to the FBI for our friends south of the border, and the Department of National Defense. The government also owns approximately 9,000 commercial medium heavy-duty vehicles, 10,000 other vehicles such as motorcycles, snowmobiles, off-road vehicles, and industrial equipment, and so on. All this combined, the road vehicles make up 47 kilotons of annual emissions, or about 4.5% of the government's operations, of the emission of the government operations. And so as of last year, 33% of all light duty vehicle purchases were hybrid electric vehicles, and zero emission vehicles, about 13% in 2021. And now green vehicles comprise about 8%, 8.5% of the conventional light duty vehicle fleet. Go to the next slide. So what does NRCan do? This is where we come in. So to support the greening government strategy, NRCan's Green Fleets program, under the operational lead of my colleague Craig Miller, offers federal departments and agencies turnkey solutions to inform how to best green their fleet. We do this in a number of ways. We provide fleet assessments, building readiness assessments. We make available best practices and studies, as well as we've run some more smaller ad hoc pilots, such as, for example, in 2021, I believe we converted the pickup truck into a zero emission vehicle pickup truck, which is one of the first for the government of Canada. And so budget 2022 actually provided us, NRCan, an additional 2.2 million over 5 years to continue the great work that we do, in particular with a focus on some of the underserved fleets, such as crown corporations like Canada Post that Nick mentioned. Go to the next one, please. All right, so let's dive in. What is it that we do? We do a number of things. So our electric vehicle suitability assessments, it's really the use of telematic-based monitoring and vehicle usage pattern analysis to identify which fleet vehicles are best suited to be replaced with zero emission vehicle alternative based on the anticipated total cost of ownerships, the range capability, the operational requirements of that fleet, and so on. So I blurred my background, so I'm not sure if people can see this, but this is a logger, a telematic logger, also called a dongle. And what we do is we procure those and ship those to the fleet managers across the federal government. And they plug those into the vehicles, and that little device here collects all the data that we need. And then we analyze the data. So the data collection period can range from about 8 to 12 months. And we do that sort of time period because we want to capture the seasonality. Obviously, Canada has very strong differences between summer and winter. So we want to capture that seasonality, which is why we do it up to 12 months. And at the end of that, there's a final report which sort of summarizes the characteristics of the fleet's utilization profile and identifies which vehicles at the end of the day could be replaced with lower carbon options, which are then we look at which vehicles can be replaced and which vehicles are available in the government motor vehicle ordering guide. So that's the fleet suitability assessments. Last year, we started the pilot to do electric vehicle readiness assessments for building sort of, federally owned facilities. So what we do there is we do a comprehensive review of the facility's existing electrical service, its spare capacity, its demand profile, its load profile, and see how this building or that facility sort of what changes would need to be made to the building in order to install electric vehicle chargers. So not only does the assessment provide the information about the amount of chargers that they need, but it also identifies any electrical service upgrades that they may require to do. So it's really that the combination of the electric vehicle suitability assessments as well as the electric vehicle readiness assessments at the federal buildings or facilities that provide fleet managers with sort of a more holistic, comprehensive overview of what it is that they are required to do or encouraged to do to green their own operations through the fleet. Next slide, please. All right, so the results to date. So far, we've assessed close to 3,500 vehicles across 17 departments and agencies and recommended just shy of 1,200 vehicles to be replaced with hybrid or zero-emission vehicles. This translates to over 1 million liters of fuel saved annually, which if you look at the gasoline prices today is quite remarkable. So that number that I have here, the 8.5 million, is probably an older number. So I would reckon that that number will be closer to 10 million. So that fuel saving also translates to about 2,610 tons of CO2 reductions potentials annually as well. And departments have been really stellar in sort of implementing our recommendations. They have bought more than 1,100 hybrid electric vehicles and 450 zero-emission vehicles over the past 4 years, and installed more than 230 EV chargers. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have this more ambitious target now, the really electrified entire federal light-duty vehicle fleet by 2030. So in support of this target, NRCan struck 3 committees together with Nick's team at the Treasury Board Secretariat, as well as fleet owning departments, to collectively dive deeper into the considerations and requirements to acquire ZEVs, to acquire infrastructure, to develop new policies and develop new financial tools as well. The goal here really is to mobilize the federal fleet community, because it is a community at the end of the day. They all know each other. There's about we've done 17 departments. It's a close-knit community, and what we want to do is come together as a collective and identify the challenges and opportunities around topics such as ZEV vehicles, charging infrastructure, policy, finance, and so on. So it's really integral to the initiative to gather and validate data and share data. And sort of these insights that we have, although we just started with those 3 subcommittees, but I think the insights that we'll gather will be used to model the year-over-year procurement scenarios up to 2030. And I'll speak to that a bit later on, including capital and operational costs compared to the business as usual scenario. Next slide. I think that's my last slide, actually. So I mentioned that in addition to the vehicle suitability assessments and the electric vehicle readiness assessments of buildings, we also like to have some fun, and we'd like to do some more ad hoc projects and pilots. So one of the examples here is the electric vehicle supply equipment procurement preparedness guide. It's a bit of a mouthful, I admit, but it's a guiding document that helps users account for the various fleet and facility considerations relevant to the procurement of charging infrastructure. And at the end of the day, if people are using this tool, it will help them inform and develop a statement of work, which is needed, as you know, to initiate a contract, for example. And as I mentioned previously, we've been collaborating with Parks Canada in 2020, and we worked with a Montreal-based company called EcoTune to convert sort of the iconic Ford F-150 into a battery electric with a battery electric powertrain, resulting in the first fully electric pickup truck in the entire federal fleet. So we're definitely hoping to do more of that, more of the conversions, more of the repowers, but also just continue with the suitability assessments, the readiness assessments, and the 3 subcommittees that we struck recently. I'll leave it there, but really looking forward to the conversation, the discussion.
Thank you so much, Thierry. I mean, a really nice way to follow on from Nick's kind of overall picture, to have that view from your particular job of decarbonising the government fleet Really interesting to see what you said there. So 4.5% of government operations emissions come from their fleets, but the work you're already doing, producing lots of benefits, reducing costs, reducing emissions there. Like what you said, because I think we're getting questions in about funding, and I want to pick up on that in a minute. So it was interesting to see how happy you were, the big smile on your face when you talked about the funding that you'd received in the most recent budget to continue with this area, because I think that's probably an issue that a lot of people are interested in. And fascinating to see the work that you're doing with those dongles, just to see the real practical work of how you're gathering the evidence to target that investment going forward. So taking that real evidence-based approach, and then ending there with how you're helping people to put forward the business case for investment in things like infrastructure and procuring the infrastructure they need. So thank you to both of you for those brilliant opening remarks. To people who joined us after the initial introductions, just to say, if you do want to switch to French, there is the opportunity to do that. Just click on the interpretation icon and you will have that option there. We are getting lots and lots of questions in, so I'm going to go to those very shortly, but I want to just kick off by asking something that struck me, which is obviously you've raised the kind of benefits from this and the urgency, the need for government to be showing leadership in this critical area. But I'm just interested, I guess I'm going to ask two things here. What are the biggest barriers for civil servants, for public servants in meeting these carbon reduction targets of their own operations? So what's stopping people doing some of these things? And do you think that, you know, we seem to be in this permanent state of crises, whether it's a pandemic or a war in Ukraine, for example, is that distracting people from focusing on this urgent agenda? So I guess the question is kind of, how should people really address this as a matter of urgency? Nick, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So, you know, I always say nobody sort of wakes up in the morning saying I want to trash the planet. So really, I think it's we know that they want to take action. People want to take action, but the two biggest barriers are really, I would say, what comes around costing and funding, which we've seen lots of questions coming in on, and then the technical knowledge on how to do it, right? So the natural thinking is it's going to cost a lot of money and technically hard to do. And what we've tried to indicate is actually it's not going to cost that much over a life cycle, if anything, and over the life cycle of the product. And technically it's doable, especially a lot of these things with today's technology. In some areas, we still need some evolution of technology. But I'll use a vehicle as an example. Over the life cycle of a vehicle, and I love your stats there, Thierry, it's cheaper to have an electric vehicle. So, but it's an upfront cost, right? So the cost questions are real questions, because if it's 10% more or 20% more to buy it, how do I afford that? But of course, it costs less to maintain it, and you'll save it over the O&M. So really, it's a question of how do you move maintenance and operating costs to capital, right? And that's the same thing for buildings. And there's various ways to do that in government. So, and then technically, so what's possible? What's out there? I've never driven an electric car. I've never seen what, heated my building with heat pumps. So what does that mean? And so that's where we've, relied on the expertise of TAD and departments that are specialized in these areas to kind of hold the hand of departments that are implementers, if you will, and say, this is how we can help you get to zero carbon. This is how it's technically possible. Here's the different solutions, et cetera. And sorry, the other question you had was kind of on prioritization. And so I would say, climate change is always a significant, probably the biggest priority for all of us for the planet, right? So it's not hard necessarily to tell people that, but there are short-term things like COVID happens, but COVID's helped us in some ways because we've become resilient to a pandemic. Operations have started, supply chains are thinking about how to do it, et cetera. And a lot of those lessons actually can be ported over to resilience to climate change. So in some cases, it's actually very helpful. Like in the war in Ukraine is another example where countries are saying, how do we become energy self-sufficient, right, and not rely on fossil fuels from a different country? So there are a lot of areas where you can actually have benefits, and being better at addressing climate change can actually make you better at addressing COVID or supply chain issues from war and things like that. So these things are very complementary, I would say, or can be.
Thanks, Nick. Terry, the same questions to you, but I also want to add in, because we've had a question from Haley, which I think picks up on what Nick said there about one of the barriers being funding. And you mentioned obviously the funding that you've just received for your area. And Haley says, how are options, so low carbon or climate resilient options, weighted for federal programs in Canada? Nick, you might want to come back on as well, but if these options are estimated at significantly higher costs, and similarly for existing federal programs that are interested in innovating to use low carbon, but the innovation will require funding, are there other funding programs that federal initiatives can access? So Thierry,
great, thanks. Yeah, I'll start with your first two questions. I'll try at least to answer the question from Haley, although I may have to toss some of it over to Nick. I mean, Nick, I could talk about total cost of ownership all day long, and sort of the awareness barrier. That's sort of my bread and butter at Banner Can, in addition to green government operations. But some of the biggest challenges facing departments, or in my case, sort of the fleet operators or fleet managers, I think right now it's supply and availability of vehicles. As you mentioned, like supply chains have been disrupted due to the pandemic, but it's maybe a bit more systemic now as well. And it really has, the pandemic really has wreaked havoc on the global supply chain for vehicles, EVs in particular, LDVs in general, but EVs in particular. So the wait times are such that vehicles ordered now may not arrive in your federal fleet for years. So that's actually even more so on the medium and heavy duty vehicle side and special purpose vehicles, where the market is still fairly nascent, and they're produced at sort of lower volumes. And this means that federal fleet managers are not only competing sort of amongst themselves or against one another to try to capture that limited supply, but they're also going after the same vehicles in many instances than the general population. So coupled with the sheer number of vehicles that need to be replaced, I think it's just a very daunting task for fleet managers and federal departments. The other challenge is charging infrastructure. So fleet managers need to know how many chargers and what type, build enough to future-proof their operations, but they also have limited funds. I guess starting to answer Haley's questions a little bit, but they have limited budgets as well. So they're now being asked, so fleet managers across the federal departments are now being asked to become experts in EVs, and as simple as they may be to drive with all the known benefits, the installation of charging infrastructure, for example, requires them to know the technical specs of the equipment, load management systems, etc. In short, it's a lot for them to learn, and yeah, we can do some of it. We're here to provide assistance. We're here to provide tools and our expertise. But I think it's also just a bit of a daunting task for fleet managers to navigate this still relatively novel mode of transportation. The second question about sort of you mentioned the state of permanent crisis, and Nick mentioned that climate change, it is the existential threat to humanity, I believe. So this is really our lodestar. Like I don't think we're veering off course just because there are other sort of distractions, as important as they may be. And we have really enshrined the net zero target for 2050 in the Emissions Accountability Act. So this is something that we have to do, whether there's distractions or not. And of course, there are competing priorities that may take some focus away, and rightfully and understandably so. Like Nick mentioned COVID, there has been relief payments and spending on health emergencies that have obviously taken resources away from governments across the globe, including Canada. At the same time, we've seen like economic stimulus spending and Build Back Better spending that have equally resulted in historic investments in green and clean technologies and helping the workforce transition to adapt to this new reality. Lots of RD&D and other investments. So I think it's sort of we have this lodestar of like the net zero 2050 target, but also the opportunity to have economic stimulus spending. And when it comes to Ukraine, I mean, the atrocities being committed in Russia obviously deserve the government's attention, but they do not distract from our climate goals. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, that we have seen the global fuel prices rise. And as I mentioned earlier, that number of 8.5 million is closer to 10 million now. That sort of illustrates the savings that fleet managers can realize if they're switching to electric vehicles.
Thanks, Terry.
Yeah.
Nick, we've got loads of questions coming. Did you, in 30 seconds, want to give Hayley any pointers on where she could go for additional funding?
I think there's no magic bullet, but there is, like in any government, you can make a case for funding for whatever you're working on, right? And so there are methods for how to get new funding for new proposals. But there are two funds we have centrally, the Green Government Fund and the Low Carbon Fuels Fund for those type of things. And also, just like Thierry mentioned, it's how do we do things differently? Like, how do we not buy the same amount of vehicles we used to have, right? How do you do some analytics? How do you figure out what buildings you need to keep, what don't you need to keep? Can you do things differently? Because we just can't afford to do things the same way we've always done them. So, this is an opportunity to think about things a bit differently.
Thanks, Nick. Right, so we've had 3 questions in on the subject of kind of remote working, and I guess how the pandemic has changed working practices. So from Andrew, Jacob, and Gabrielle. Andrew asked you, Nick, but I think it's equally relevant for you, Thierry, whether the commuting emissions changed as a was that a benefit with people working from home? And Jacob similarly, and Gabrielle has said, has kind of ongoing remote working changed your analysis of kind of the emissions that you're expecting from government operations, and has it changed any of your plans going forward? Thierry, I'm going to come to you because I guess there's been less traveling around, has there? So that's something you're factoring in.
There absolutely has, and I think it's important to remember that the Green Government strategy talks about mobility in more general terms. It's not just about fleets; it's about mobility, and it does encourage teleworking. It does encourage people carpooling or active transportation like bicycling or running or what have you, and this was actually. Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, like set in stone prior to the pandemic. So we've always encouraged people to be to make use of transit as well, to carpool, to find alternative ways other than just single occupancy vehicles to drive to work. Obviously, the pandemic, if there's such a thing as a good thing about the pandemic, it is that people have been able to telework, and going forward, I think that's going to be a bit of a mainstay for the government of Canada, at least provide people the flexibility to work remotely. In terms of the emissions, we haven't sort of tracked ourselves, our department, tracked the emission reductions from that. We do the telematic assessments for the federal fleet, and for the most part, those vehicles are sort of mission critical, so they have been in operation even during the pandemic. So we wouldn't have necessarily seen a huge dip. Like national safety and security still has been even more so maybe important during the pandemic. So those vehicles, the RCMP and other special purpose vehicles have been in operation. So there probably wasn't a huge reduction in emissions from, at least stemming from the pandemic.
Thanks. And Nick, I guess there are other areas where the kind of change to a remote working, teleworking has reduced emissions. So, for example, from the government state, is that an area you're looking at? Or have we just transferred them, those emissions, to people's homes? Overall, what's the picture?
Yeah, so I mean, the emissions to look at really are from air travel, business travel, if you will, commuting, and then the real property footprint, right? So how many buildings we heat and cool and electrify. So that's the kind of areas that, and there's no easy picture. Like it really, we've seen air travel emissions reduce by about the first year pandemic, reduced 80 to 90% of air travel emissions. Commuting, we don't have a good estimate of what it is now, but like Kitty said, like if you're a prison guard, you're still commuting into work, right? Like, so it's really office workers have changed, but if you're in the science lab, if you're on national safety security kind of issues, you're still working there. So I don't want to overestimate that reduction, but it's also, you look at heating and cooling federal buildings versus heating and cooling homes, right? Your individual homes. What's the waste generated at the office versus at home? What's the, what's your behavior at home in terms of, do you drive to the end of town for lunch, or do you just bring your lunch and those kinds of things, or make your lunch at home? So there's various different sort of things to look at. But overall, we think emissions are down because commuting emissions are down, travel emissions are down. You don't necessarily heat your home a lot more, compared to the office building, so the difference in energy use at home isn't that significant. The other thing to keep in mind is the bigger picture of land use planning that our old model is. Our old model is our homes are used half the day and empty half the day. Our offices are used half the day and empty the other half of the day. And we all pile on the same transportation infrastructure for 4 hours a day. And we build that transportation infrastructure for peak times. And so it's empty the rest of the day. So, and then we say we can't afford it. Like, of course we can't afford it. So this COVID has let us kind of re-examine all this and think about what's a better way of doing things. And it's also for national governments, from a recruiting point of view, can you recruit people anywhere in the country? And do you have better diversity? Do you have better regional representation? Like, are there other co-benefits to what's happening? So all of those things need to be factored in. I'd love to see somebody do a comprehensive study on that. We can only look at emissions directly from certain areas, but it's also to reduce footprint. You need to reduce real property footprint to make a difference. And of course, when a government owns a building, you can't just get rid of it the next day. So that, like, the change will be a bit slower as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Terry, we've had lots of questions come in on electric vehicle charging, the infrastructure for this. So Daryl has asked, how quickly is the infrastructure for EVs being implemented? Right now, commercially, you can't drive an EV across Ontario or the prairies. And I want to add to that a question from Domain Martin, who has said, have funding requirements been quantified and approved for the installation of zero emission vehicle charging? And in particular, will this federal charging infrastructure be available for use by the public? I think that's an interesting question. So will it double up for use by the public? There's a lot of other questions. We might come back to those if we have time, but if not, we'll make sure we get those to you, Thierry, afterwards. You can, we'll answer after. But that thing about the speed and then maybe the cost, and will the public benefit from that as well? Would you like to answer those two?
Absolutely. So the Department of Natural Resources has been providing funding since 2016 to build out a network of EV chargers. We first focused on sort of the coast-to-coast travel. A lot of people have this perception that they want to travel from Vancouver, Victoria Island to St. John's, Newfoundland in an EV, and so we wanted to provide them that public confidence that they can do that. So we've really built this network along the national highway system with over 1,000 fast chargers. We've actually exceeded our target of 1,000 fast chargers. But we've also realized, and these are chargers that are absolutely accessible to the public. They actually have to be, by definition, accessible to the public. And so we also realized that it's not just about the sort of the long distance travel coast to coast, but it's about providing Canadians the infrastructure where they live, work, and play. So that's at your local grocery store, it's at the hockey arena, it's at the movie theater. It's also where you work, so workplace charging, and it's also where you live. About a third of Canadians live in what's known as multi-unit residential buildings. So we have specific programs that focus on providing charging infrastructure, providing funding for charging infrastructure in all of these areas that I mentioned. And so right now we have approved for funding projects that would deliver about 25,000 additional chargers across Canada. We have a target right now of 34,500 chargers. And as I mentioned earlier, budget 2022 was kind to us and provided us an additional 900 million to offset the cost of an additional 50,000 chargers that are being installed across Canada. So absolutely, the charging infrastructure network is growing. Currently there's about 19,000 chargers across Canada. We're adding many more, so 24,000, 34,000, 50,000. So we're really ramping up the amount of charging that is needed, because we do have these really ambitious targets of 100% CEF sales by 2035. So the charging infrastructure, it's an important question, because the charging infrastructure needs to grow ahead of the deployment of the vehicle. Again, going back to that public confidence, if people don't know that the charging infrastructure exists, they don't buy the vehicle. With regards to the question about driving across Ontario, absolutely possible. I've driven from Ottawa to Vancouver and back last year in an EV. Absolutely no issue. And again, all the money that we have for Enercan's charging infrastructure programs, it's for public use.
Thanks, Jerry. Nick, I've got a question for you here that's come in from Jeff Bowlby, who says, I run the census in Canada. The census is one of the largest operations of government, involving 30,000 plus temporary employees, the opening of dozens of offices, and the use of tons of paper. There is lots of scope for greening, and today's presentation is helpful for understanding how to do it. My question is, what are we doing to green the government's use of personal vehicles? So I guess those temporary employees, and what programs are in place to reduce paper use in government? I like this question.
Well, for personal vehicles, I mean, ultimately, part of the message too here is that all of us need to make the right decisions, right? All of us need to look at when you green an organization or your life, you got to look at your house. How do you heat and cool it? What do you take to move around? And then what do you buy? And what's the emissions from the things you buy? So we can support employees in the sense that we can ensure we got active infrastructure for active transportation, for example, bike racks, showers, etc. at federal offices, or for the census. If you're setting up temporary offices for the census or whatever, then make sure you have that infrastructure, or you rent a space that has that infrastructure so you can support your employees and help them make those good decisions. For their mobility, right? You want to locate somewhere that's on transit, right? You want to locate somewhere that they can get to, right? Don't locate an office in the middle of nowhere if you don't have to, right? So there are decisions we can make when we expand our operations that support our employees and help them make the right decisions. The other thing I was going to say, just on the last one, in terms of personal employees making decisions, new electric vehicles, the new models are like, the ranges are 400 kilometers, right? Like, so the old kind of thinking that, I can only go 100 kilometers and I can only go 50 in the winter and I need to charge every block, like, that's gone. Like 400 kilometers, you're driving to Montreal and back, from Ottawa to Montreal and back, right? Like you don't need to charge every second of the day. So keep in mind the new car's range is incredible, and the good work of putting more charging stations everywhere. So for the employees, they don't necessarily need to charge at work anymore. And arguably, environmentally, you don't want to charge during the day because it's peak time, and you actually want to charge at night, right, off peak. So like, some of the misconceptions of the early electric vehicles are still there. That also would need to be, people need to kind of realize, okay, the new vehicles actually have long ranges. It's better to charge them at night. Where do we need that infrastructure? We don't all have a gas station in our driveway. We don't all have a gas station at every parking lot of every federal building. We don't all necessarily need a charger everywhere, right, anymore. So it's just, that's why the good work of the analytics to figure out where you need the charging infrastructure, what's the behavior, and where do you need it to give people confidence. So.
And it goes back to what you were saying in your opening presentation, that things need to be updated all the time because technology and things are constantly changing and improving. Okay, Thierry, a couple more questions for you. We had one in from Robert Bolden in before the webinar, who said, can you acknowledge that there are environmental costs to the manufacture of electric vehicles? So they're not entirely carbon neutral. He asked for your thoughts on that. And I want to link that to a question from Jeff Coate that's come in saying, there seems to be a big push on hydrogen versus EV. So your thoughts on that as well, considering that maybe EVs have some concerns. So just your thoughts on those two questions.
Yeah, just on the first one. I mean, there's a famous study that I keep referencing when I have questions like this. It's from the Union of the Concerned Scientists, and it's you know, probably a bit outdated, but I think it's still valid. The analysis that's provided in the study that shows that yes, it takes more. It's more carbon intense to manufacture an electric vehicle compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle. And that's mainly, predominantly because of the battery. The battery, the sourcing of the material, the production of the battery itself. You know, a lot of the resources historically come from further away, from places like China and Africa and South America. So it takes a bit of quite a lot of carbon to ship them to a central location to manufacture the cathodes of the batteries and then put them into the vehicle. But these emissions are offset the more you drive. So as soon as you start driving, you actually chip away at that initial emission from the manufacturing. And I think depending on how clean the electrical grids are where you drive your electric vehicle, and Canada is very fortunate in that regard that over 80% of the electricity comes from non-emitting sources with a target of, I think, 90% or even 100% by 2030. Those emissions are reduced. Like as the more you drive, the faster you reduce the emissions from that initial increase from the battery manufacturing. And Canada actually has a very strong battery play as well. We have all the critical metals and minerals and rare earth metals to produce batteries and cathode materials as well. And we have, if not the highest environmental standard when it comes to mining those minerals and metals. So I think the emissions reductions potential from batteries produced in Canada are quite extraordinary, coupled with the clean grid that we have in Canada as well. On hydrogen, I mean, Jeffrey's right. We're committed to making sure that hydrogen deserves, you know, has a place in Canada's economy. Last year, Natural Resources Canada developed a hydrogen strategy for Canada that sort of laid out the roadmap, the blueprint of how to produce hydrogen in Canada, how to export it, and how to integrate it into the transportation system. I think there's a really strong play for hydrogen, especially when it comes to medium and heavy duty vehicles, longer range vehicles like trucks that sort of drive coast to coast or even down south. I think there's absolutely an application for hydrogen in those types of scenarios and duty cycles.
Thanks, Terry. Nick, back to you. We're getting such great questions in. So Veronique Malta has said, is buying offset credits part of the greening government strategy? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so for scope 1, 2 emissions, it is not. So for our emissions from our buildings in our fleet, it is not part of the strategy. We want to aim to reduce emissions directly, get to zero carbon. Now, we do allow carbon removal, which is a really high-end quality offset, which is basically permanently removing carbon for our national safety and security fleet. So for air and marine military operations, the government will ask the military, go out on 10 missions this year, go out on 20 next year, etc. So part of the solution there is to move to low carbon fuels for air and marine, but we recognize we may need to do some carbon removal equivalent to some of the emissions there. We also do allow offsets for we call grants and contributions. So if the government of Canada gives money to an outside organization to, let's say, put on a conference or to do something, then offsets can be eligible for that. Can be eligible expense under that. So, if somebody's putting on a conference and they want to offset the travel, et cetera, of folks, then they could do that. But for public servants and for our direct emissions, we want to reduce them. We don't want to offset them. We want to reduce them.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nick. There is a question here from Benita Johnson. Again, to you, Terry. Are there plans to recycle the materials from vehicles that are being decommissioned?
That's a good question. One that I'll probably have to take back to my colleagues that have a bit more knowledge on the battery on the battery side of things. But I know that there's absolutely a business case to recycle material from batteries. There are Canadian companies, Li-Cycle comes to mind, which is a Toronto-based company that is able to recycle, I think, 95% of all the material from batteries to into its different components, and then with those components they can make batteries from fresh. But there's also a second life of a battery. So once it's had its useful life in the vehicle, those batteries are still very capable to perform elsewhere. For example, at grid scale storage for solar and wind application, for example. So the battery that you may discard, quote unquote, after its life in the vehicle has still a useful life elsewhere. And then at that end of that life, it's definitely being recycled. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I can't believe how fast the time has gone. We are almost at the end of our webinar, so we've probably only got time to squeeze in a couple of questions. I'll probably put 2 questions to both of you, and you can answer one or both as the final round of questions. But just to say to the audience as well, that thank you so much for your great questions. We haven't managed to answer all of them. There's been a lot in particular around electric vehicles and charging. So Thierry, if you don't mind, we'll probably pass those on to you afterwards and see if we can get all those answered.
Please, yeah.
Scenes, if that's okay. Also to say to the audience, you might have received a questionnaire in your inboxes. Please take a couple of minutes to fill that in. It just means that we can make sure we provide the webinars that are most useful for you. So I'd be hugely grateful if you don't mind doing that. It'll only take a couple of moments. But back now to our final round of questions. I want to, again, I'm going to ask a question that's coming from the audience and then one final one of my own, because I think they link nicely together. So Matt Bigelow has asked, will citizens need to accept a reduced standard of living in the path towards net zero? How should we expect our daily lives to change? I know that's a little bit outside government operations, but as you're such experts in this area, I think it's quite a nice question to answer. And then my question, I guess, which is related to that is, given that our audience are public servants who will be really interested in what you said today, what would you like them to be doing now? What's the 1 or 2 things that you think they should be doing now to help with this greening government agenda? Thierry, I'm going to come to you first.
Sure, thanks for the question. So on the first one, I think, and I'm probably doing a terrible job, but I'm going to quote our own Prime Minister, and I think he said something to the effect that the economy and the environment go hand in hand. And I know it sounds very bureaucratic, but I think I absolutely believe that's true. We've talked a little bit about total cost of ownership and the price of gasoline, for example. When it comes to purchasing a zero emission vehicle, I think that's really important to keep in mind that the total cost of ownership. So, you know, from the day you purchase it all the way to the end of your ownership, zero emission vehicles are cheaper. They're cheaper to run. Electricity is cheaper than gasoline, especially now. They are cheaper to maintain. In certain instances, they are cheaper to insure as well. Plus, we have the federal incentive run by Transport Canada of up to $5,000 to offset that initial capital investment. So I don't think you need to compromise sort of your cost of living or your other expenses, because again, over the life of the vehicle, electric vehicles are make a ton of sense, and they're cheaper to run. When it comes to sort of the what can government employees do, sort of a very bureaucratic answer would be like talk to your procurement officers. I think they have a lot to say about green procurement. They can talk about the constraints I mentioned, the supply chain constraints, and just the availability, not just of vehicles, but the availability of all services and goods. I think it's really important to talk to the experts, to talk to the procurement officers about the delays and plan and prepare for those delays. So that's, I think, probably a good way to start. Something that's more tangible is become familiar with a zero emission vehicle. We've done a study last year, public opinion research, that showed that 66% of Canadians have never driven or ridden in a zero emission vehicles, but they would like to. So, you know, call up your local EV society or owners club. They're putting on ride and drive events all across Canada. Take advantage of that. We're actually supporting a lot of these projects as well, or a lot of these ride and drive events through NRCan. So, you know, get familiar with this new technology. And then lastly, I guess, you know, a fora like this is really important to share sort of the collective shared experiences with others. And it's important for us to communicate and learn what others are doing. I think that's probably 2 or 3 things that anyone can do.
Thanks, Jerry. Really practical advice, and I like that message of sharing and collaborating. Really good. Nick, we started with you. I'm going to ask you for some.
Sure. So I'm a big believer that innovation happens because we adopt things that are better and that produce better, that are more productive, that increase productivity and just perform better. In addition to saving money, if you drive an EV and you see you hit the gas, you hit the go pedal, and you see how fast it goes, it's just a better car. It's a better drive. So you'll never go back to a gas vehicle ever again. So it's like we're adopting this stuff because it's better. If you heat a house with a heat pump, it's better than a natural gas furnace. It'll heat better. So, you know, get a heat pump to heat a house, buy an electric vehicle, or find some, you know, way to avoid using a vehicle if you can. And you become zero carbon, and buy things that are less carbon intensive, that are more local, that are better for local business, etc. So think about that. I don't think our standard of living will suffer. I actually think it's the opposite. We can't afford to continue the way we are continuing, and our standard of living will crash. We can't afford it. So we need to be more productive. You can't afford to have a roof of a huge box store not producing electricity. Like it's just insane. So we have to not have single purpose things and have multi-purpose things. It'll increase productivity, it'll save us money, and they just perform better. So, and what can public servants do? Do exactly what Jeff did with the census. Ask how you can green your own operations. What can you do? And Jeff, you can call me, we can chat more, but in any business you do, anything you do as a public servant that you're delivering, how's climate change going to impact your operations and services and the assets you run? And how can you make them go to zero carbon and climate resilient? That's a great question to ask, and we can help on that analysis. But that's the first thing, is to start asking, how can I help? And you have control over what you deliver and what your program is, and you have control, and you can make decisions on how to green those.
Fantastic! What a brilliant place to end there. I think, as you say, that key message: we can't afford not to do these things. We can't afford not to make these changes. And also every single one of us, wherever we sit in government, can make a difference. And it's just about asking those questions. Sadly, we are out of time. I just want to say a huge thanks. Thank you to the audience for all your great questions. But thank you most of all to Nick and to Thierry for sharing your expertise with us. Been hugely helpful, hugely informative. I know that's going to have provided people with a lot of useful information. We will make sure people get the slides sent round as well for the people who registered, and contact details, as you say, Nick and Thierry, if people want to contact you, that would be amazing. We will send a link with this video to everybody who registered for the webinar, so you can watch it all again, or you can share it with your colleagues as well. And we will also be producing an article with the key issues that came out of today's discussion, which will be sent round in a couple of weeks' time. So that just leaves me to say thank you to our panel, thank you to everyone for watching, and have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you've joined us from today. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, thank you.